spring of 1944. The air in central Texas was heavy with heat and dust. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of a prisoner of war camp, hundreds of German soldiers gathered in a wooden mess hall built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The building smelled of boiled vegetables, coffee, and machine oil from the nearby maintenance yard. Long rows of benches filled the space, and tin plates clattered against the tables as guards ordered the prisoners to take their seats. The men moved in silence, many still wearing patched remnants of their field gray uniforms, their insignias removed, their boots worn from a war that now seemed impossibly far away. A young soldier from the Afrika Korps sat down, exhausted from a morning of labor in the cotton fields. When a cook placed a portion of meat, mashed potatoes, and a slice of pie on his tray, he froze. The food was warm, the portions generous, the smell strangely familiar. Across the room, through the open doorway, he could see American guards sitting at another table, eating the same meal from identical trays. No separation by rank, no visible difference in quality. It was not the thin soup or stale bread he expected from captivity, but the kind of meal a soldier might receive in a proper army mess hall. For many prisoners that day, the experience was more shocking than any interrogation. In the Wehrmacht, food was a reflection of hierarchy. Officers ate better, non-commissioned men received what was left, and prisoners, especially those captured by the Soviets or on the Eastern Front, were lucky to receive anything beyond survival rations. Yet here, in a camp thousands of miles from Europe, their captors offered them a meal that mirrored the daily ration of American troops stationed at home bases. The contrast was so profound that many assumed it was a mistake, a temporary display for propaganda. The mess hall itself symbolized an order that most Germans had never witnessed during the war. The interior was clean and organized, with posted rules about sanitation, meal schedules, and caloric requirements printed in both English and German. The U.S. Army had strict guidelines. Every prisoner of war was to receive food equal in quantity and quality to that served to American soldiers in depot units. It was not an act of kindness but of regulation, a commitment to the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the War Department had vowed to follow meticulously. Even in captivity, bureaucracy dictated morality. Outside, the camp stretched over the Texas plains, lined with barracks, laundry facilities, and a hospital ward. Beyond the fence lay cotton fields and civilian farms, where groups of prisoners were sent to work under supervision. Each day, trucks returned from the fields in time for supper, their passengers dusty and sunburned. They washed at outdoor taps, lined up with military precision, and marched into the mess hall. The rhythm of captivity was mechanical, but within it lay moments of quiet astonishment, such as the simple realization that their captors saw them not as animals, but as soldiers bound by the same necessities of hunger and fatigue. That first meal in the camp marked the beginning of a slow, unsettling redefinition of what it meant to be defeated. The Germans had been trained to believe that capture meant humiliation and deprivation. Instead, they encountered order, discipline, and a sense of fairness they did not expect. The equality of the meal was more than sustenance. It was a message written in rations, an introduction to a system that valued procedure over hatred. For those who sat at those wooden tables under the humming ceiling fans of Texas, the taste of that first dinner became a moment they would remember long after the war ended, a moment when the boundaries between victor and vanquished began, quietly, to dissolve. For a German soldier raised in the rigid hierarchy of the Third Reich, equality was not a virtue but an absurdity. The army he came from was built on order, obedience, and division, between ranks, between races, between conqueror and conquered. From his first day in uniform, he had learned that privilege flowed downward from the top. Officers dined in separate quarters, served by enlisted men. Non-commissioned officers ate next, often finishing what remained from the officers' table. Ordinary soldiers received their meals last, sometimes cold, sometimes spoiled, and always with the reminder that they were replaceable. Food in the Wehrmacht was never simply nourishment. It was a measure of power. To be captured, therefore, meant to descend to the bottom of all hierarchies. Prisoners expected starvation. Many of them carried memories from the Eastern Front, where surrender to Soviet forces often meant death by exposure or hunger. Even within German-controlled territories, Allied prisoners had been subjected to minimal rations and harsh labor. The men arriving in American camps had no reason to believe their experience would be any different. For them, captivity was synonymous with humiliation, deprivation, and erasure of status. But the system that awaited them in the United States operated on principles that were almost bureaucratically moral. The American military had adopted the 1929 Geneva Convention not as a gesture of goodwill, but as an article of military law. It stated that all prisoners of war must receive food equal in quantity and quality to that of the detaining powers' depot troops. It was not a suggestion, it was a binding regulation that commanders were obligated to enforce. The U.S. War Department saw adherence to these rules as a reflection of national identity. To treat the enemy within the law was to prove that democracy could remain intact even in total war. For the prisoners, this distinction was incomprehensible. In their eyes, victors had no reason to restrain themselves. They had been taught that mercy was weakness, and that power existed to dominate. When they saw that American guards ate the same meals they did, many interpreted it as mockery or propaganda. Some believed it was temporary, that once the Red Cross left, rations would be cut to punish them. Others thought it was psychological warfare, designed to make them doubt the moral superiority of their homeland. But the truth was more unsettling. The Americans were simply following procedure. This procedural fairness struck directly at the foundation of the worldview the Reich had built. The German ideology of the time celebrated order, but it was an order built on inequality. The American version of order, by contrast, was built on uniformity, every man receiving his ration by the same measure, recorded, verified, and inspected. For the guards and administrators, feeding a prisoner properly was not a matter of sympathy but of discipline. To violate the convention would be to compromise the very image of the U.S. Army. As weeks passed, the prisoners began to notice that this equality was not an exception but the rule. They saw it in the way the food was distributed, the way supplies were logged, and the way complaints were handled. Even when shortages affected local civilians, when sugar or coffee were rationed at home, the Army ensured that POW camps met their nutritional quotas. This policy angered some American citizens, who resented the idea that enemy soldiers might eat better than families on the home front. Yet to the War Department, consistency mattered more than popularity. Feeding the enemy according to the law was part of the nation's self-definition, a statement that civilization could exist even inside barbed wire. For German soldiers who had grown up under propaganda that dehumanized opponents and glorified suffering, this reality created an internal conflict. How could an enemy so feared on the battlefield behave with such restraint in victory? How could a country that had bombed their cities insist on counting their calories? The paradox was almost intolerable. Their concept of power had been built around fear, not fairness. The meal before them challenged everything they had been told about weakness and strength. The problem, then, was not hunger but understanding. Captivity in America confronted them with a moral system they could not easily dismiss. It was a system where equality was not a political slogan but a routine, where the same ladle that served the guards' stew also filled the prisoner's bowl. And for men who had spent years fighting for an empire built on division, that simple act of administrative fairness was perhaps the most disorienting defeat of all. By 1944, the United States had become the largest custodian of Axis prisoners of war in the world. As the Allies advanced across North Africa and Europe, tens of thousands of captured German soldiers were shipped across the Atlantic to camps scattered throughout the American interior. What began as a temporary solution to the problem of overcrowded British and North African facilities soon evolved into a vast, well-organized system of imprisonment that reflected the industrial and bureaucratic character of the United States itself. By the end of the war, more than 370,000 German POWs were held on American soil, housed in over 500 main camps and hundreds of smaller branch compounds spread from California to Georgia, from Texas to Wisconsin. The decision to house prisoners in the continental United States was both practical and symbolic. Transporting them far from the front lines prevented escape attempts and freed up ships returning from Europe, which might otherwise have sailed empty. But beyond logistics, the War Department saw an opportunity to demonstrate a distinctly American way of waging war, a form of military conduct grounded in legality and order. The treatment of prisoners became an unspoken battlefield of ideals. The United States was determined to show that a democracy could remain humane even in a total war against tyranny. The foundation for this system lay in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified and integrated into its military regulations before the war began. The convention required that prisoners be housed, clothed, and fed under conditions equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops in base camps. It also mandated medical care, correspondence rights, and inspection by neutral organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross. When America entered the war, the Provost Marshal General's office created a dedicated prisoner of war division to enforce these standards. Every detail, from camp construction to menu composition, was codified in official manuals and subject to regular review. In practice, this meant that the German soldiers who arrived in Texas, Oklahoma, or the Midwest encountered a system unlike anything they had imagined. Each camp functioned as a small military community, with barracks, recreation areas, infirmaries, libraries, and chapels. The U.S. Army engineers built them to precise specifications: wooden barracks insulated against heat and cold, kitchens equipped to serve thousands, and sanitary facilities designed to meet the same health standards as domestic bases. Camps were often located near rural areas to supply labor for agriculture, as millions of American farm workers had left for the armed forces. Under War Department regulations, prisoners could volunteer for paid labor, earning small wages redeemable at the camp canteen, a further reflection of legalistic fairness rather than generosity. Supervision was constant and methodical. Every few months, inspectors from the International Red Cross or representatives of the Swiss Embassy visited camps unannounced. They examined living quarters, interviewed prisoners, and checked ration logs. The Red Cross compared camp menus with those of U.S. Army depot units, ensuring compliance with the convention's requirement of equal quality and quantity of food. Reports from 1943 to 1945 repeatedly noted that rations in most American camps met or exceeded international standards. Even during periods of national rationing, when civilians struggled to buy meat, sugar, and coffee, the War Department maintained full POW allotments to avoid any accusation of mistreatment. To many Americans, this policy was controversial. Letters to newspapers and congressional inquiries questioned why enemy soldiers were eating meat while civilians at home faced restrictions. But the government defended its approach. Officials argued that strict adherence to the Geneva Convention not only protected American prisoners held overseas but also served as a statement of democratic strength. Fair treatment, they believed, was a weapon in itself, proof that the United States could fight without surrendering its principles. The historical moment was paradoxical. Across the ocean, cities in Germany lay in ruins from Allied bombing, and the war in Europe still raged with growing brutality. Yet within the fenced borders of the United States, men who had once served Hitler's armies lived under a system of measured order. Their days were defined by routine, paperwork, and rules rather than punishment. In an age when ideology had turned much of the world into a battlefield of extermination, the American POW program represented an attempt, imperfect but deliberate, to preserve a moral distinction between justice and vengeance. By 1945, this system stood as a quiet expression of the United States' self-image, a nation powerful enough to defeat its enemies, yet disciplined enough to feed them properly. The camps were not symbols of mercy but of control, not indulgence but law. In every meal served, in every inspection passed, the War Department sought to prove that the rule of law could survive even in the shadow of global destruction. And for the men behind the wire, that commitment to procedure was their first glimpse of a world where power was limited by principle. At first, disbelief was stronger than hunger. When the first groups of German prisoners arrived in American camps in 1943 and 1944, they brought with them expectations shaped by years of propaganda and bitter experience. Many had seen how Axis forces treated captured enemies in Europe or on the Eastern Front, how rations were withheld as punishment, how starvation was used to break morale. To them, captivity meant deprivation, and anything resembling generosity seemed not only suspicious but dangerous. When they entered the American mess halls and received full portions of meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee, the reaction was not gratitude but fear. They waited for the deception to reveal itself. Some refused to eat during their first days in captivity. In reports collected by Red Cross inspectors, camp officers described prisoners setting trays aside untouched, whispering that the food must be spoiled or laced with something harmful. Others picked at their meals cautiously, certain that such treatment could not last. The idea that their captors might feed them well out of obligation, rather than manipulation, simply did not fit into their worldview. A few demanded to see the storage rooms, believing the Americans had special supplies reserved only for display. But when they saw guards and camp personnel eating from the same kettles, the suspicions slowly began to erode. The first true catalyst for change came not from speeches or orders, but from repetition. Every day the same schedule unfolded with military precision: morning roll call, work assignments, and the steady rhythm of meals served at fixed hours. There was no reduction in rations, no sudden punishments, no games of humiliation. The consistency itself was shocking. In a world shaped by arbitrary power and shifting fortunes, predictability was something unfamiliar. Each identical meal reinforced the realization that this was not propaganda but policy. The visual evidence was impossible to ignore. Prisoners working in the kitchen saw supply crates stamped with the same military codes used for U.S. Army depots. They watched delivery trucks bring food from nearby bases, the same channels that fed American troops stationed in the region. Inspectors from the International Red Cross, often accompanied by interpreters, confirmed in their reports that POW food came directly from government stores, not from local donations or civilian markets. The logic behind it was simple but profound. If the Army rationed itself according to law, then its treatment of prisoners had to follow the same principle. Over time, the realization began to spread quietly among the camps. The guards did not make speeches about fairness, but their actions spoke for them. They lined up in the same order, ate at the same tables, and drank the same bitter coffee brewed in massive kettles. To the Germans, raised under a regime that glorified superiority and hierarchy, such equality between victor and captive was incomprehensible. The Americans appeared almost mechanical in their fairness, as though morality itself had been industrialized into procedure. The most powerful confirmation came from the absence of exceptions. Even after escape attempts or disciplinary incidents, rations were never cut as punishment. Prisoners discovered that complaints about food or sanitation were not ignored but processed through official channels. Camp inspectors took notes, sometimes making adjustments to menus or meal preparation. Each instance reinforced the idea that their captors operated under rules, not whims. That predictability, born of bureaucracy, began to erode fear more effectively than kindness could have done. The shift was gradual, almost invisible. Suspicion gave way to cautious acceptance, and acceptance to curiosity. Prisoners started to volunteer in the kitchens, drawn partly by the extra portions but also by a desire to understand how the system worked. They learned that the cooks followed printed Army recipes, measured calories per man per day, and logged every pound of flour, meat, and coffee. The men saw their names recorded not as enemies but as entries in a ledger, proof that their sustenance was not a favor but an administrative duty. This bureaucratic precision became the unexpected catalyst for trust. It was not compassion that disarmed them, but consistency. The very impersonality of the American system, the absence of hatred or favoritism, made it believable. When they finally accepted that the food came from the same supply chains that fed U.S. troops, the gesture transformed from a mystery into a lesson. What had begun as suspicion evolved into reluctant respect. The soldiers who once believed that mercy was weakness began to understand that discipline could be another form of strength. By the end of their first months in captivity, the sight of guards and prisoners eating similar meals no longer provoked disbelief. It had become part of the rhythm of camp life, as predictable as the sunrise over the Texas plains or the sound of the evening bugle. The astonishment faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. The equality of rations was not an act of generosity, but of principle. And in that realization lay the first crack in the hardened certainty of those who had once believed that strength and cruelty were the same. The American system of prisoner of war administration was designed with the same precision that characterized its military logistics. Feeding hundreds of thousands of men scattered across more than 500 camps required organization on an industrial scale. The War Department treated the process not as an act of mercy but as an operational necessity, guided by the Geneva Convention of 1929 and enforced through layers of regulations, audits, and inspections. Every calorie, every pound of flour, every kin of meat was accounted for. The office of the Provost Marshal General oversaw all aspects of POW management, including rations. The standard guideline, reaffirmed in official circulars between 1943 and 1945, specified that each prisoner was entitled to food equivalent in quantity and quality to that issued to U.S. Army depot troops. This translated into roughly 2,800 calories per day, sufficient for men engaged in moderate labor such as farm work or camp maintenance. The rations were carefully balanced, approximately 1 pound of meat or protein equivalent daily, fresh or canned vegetables, bread made from enriched flour, coffee or milk, and occasionally fruit or dessert when supplies allowed. The nutritional tables were drawn directly from Army quartermaster manuals, not improvised at the camp level. The food distribution system followed military logic. Supplies were procured through the same depots that stocked nearby bases. Trucks delivered bulk goods, flour, beans, sugar, coffee, canned beef, powdered milk, to camp warehouses under military guard. Each shipment was recorded on standardized forms, reviewed by quartermasters, and countersigned by camp commandants. Kitchens were organized like those of regular army posts: large steel kettles, ovens, and field stoves capable of serving thousands of meals 3 times a day. The schedule rarely changed, and even on holidays or inspection days the portions remained consistent. Within this system, prisoners themselves became part of the machinery. German cooks, bakers, and orderlies were assigned to kitchen duty under American supervision. This arrangement was practical. It reduced staffing demands and allowed prisoners to prepare food according to familiar tastes, as long as recipes met the nutritional requirements set by the U.S. Army. The cooks worked under a sergeant or civilian mess officer who maintained strict control over ingredients and portions. The menus, written in both English and German, were posted publicly in the mess halls, a symbolic gesture of transparency that also helped prevent rumors of unequal treatment. Discipline and hygiene were inseparable from the feeding process. Mess inspections were conducted daily. Utensils were sterilized in boiling water, food waste was weighed and logged, and leftovers were forbidden from being reused. Each camp maintained a medical officer who monitored the prisoner's health, reporting any signs of malnutrition or digestive illness to the commandant, and, by extension, the Red Cross. When shortages occurred in the civilian sector, particularly during 1944, when meat and sugar were rationed, the Army prioritized POW rations to maintain compliance with international law. The structure of oversight was multilayered. Camp quartermasters submitted weekly ration reports to regional headquarters, which consolidated the data for the War Department. Red Cross delegates conducted unannounced inspections, sometimes opening storage rooms and measuring portions themselves. These reports, preserved in archives, repeatedly described American camps as well supplied and the rations as adequate or superior to convention standards. In rare cases where discrepancies occurred, spoiled food, improper storage, or short rations, the responsible officers were reprimanded or replaced. The administration understood that any deviation from Geneva rules could trigger diplomatic backlash or propaganda exploitation by Germany. The feeding process also included a system of optional labor rations. Prisoners who volunteered for work on farms or in lumber yards received an additional 400 to 500 calories per day, usually in the form of extra bread or meat. This not only met the caloric needs of physical labor but also encouraged participation in the wartime labor program, which helped offset domestic manpower shortages. The system functioned efficiently because it was rule-based rather than discretionary. Every meal, every work assignment, and every adjustment was recorded. What emerged from this structure was a model of bureaucratic humanism, a form of order in which fairness was achieved through procedure rather than sentiment. The camp kitchens were not places of compassion but of precision. Each spoonful was measured, each rule cross-checked, each complaint documented. The very impersonality of the process became its strength. It protected both sides from the chaos of emotion. For the Americans, it proved that the law could regulate even the smallest details of war. For the prisoners, it became a daily reminder that discipline, not cruelty, defined their captors. By the end of the war, this methodical approach to feeding prisoners had become one of the quiet triumphs of military administration. Despite shortages, political pressure, and the enormity of the task, the U.S. Army maintained full compliance with the Geneva Convention. The POW ration system stood as a logistical and moral statement, showing that even in the midst of a global conflict, order and legality could be sustained with the same rigor as strategy and combat. Over time, the daily ritual of meals in the American prisoner of war camps became more than an act of sustenance, it became a quiet education in fairness. For men who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, Tunisia, or Sicily, the experience of sitting down to eat without fear, insult, or hierarchy was almost disorienting. In the Wehrmacht, food had been distributed by rank and circumstance. In captivity, it was distributed by schedule and rule. The transition from a culture of privilege and deprivation to one of order and equality reshaped the prisoners' understanding of discipline and authority. The first weeks of captivity were marked by skepticism. Many prisoners still expected humiliation. They remembered propaganda that painted Americans as corrupt materialists who disguised weakness with luxury. Yet day after day, the same meals were served, without manipulation or punishment. There were no forced fasts, no reductions in rations for infractions, no selective deprivation based on status or behavior. What shocked them was not abundance but consistency, the sense that their captors were bound by regulations they would not break, even for an enemy. Camp life followed an unvarying rhythm: morning roll call, work details, mail distribution, recreation periods, and meals at precisely the same hours. The kitchens opened early, and the smell of coffee or oatmeal spread across the compound before sunrise. Prisoners marched in groups to the mess hall, lined up in silence, and received their food from behind the same steel counters used by American troops on base. Over time, many began to volunteer for kitchen duty. The jobs were coveted, not only for the extra portions but for the small dignity of purpose. German cooks took pride in the orderliness of the process, sometimes improving recipes or baking bread that reminded them of home. The Americans allowed it, as long as the ingredients remained within official limits. In some camps, especially in Texas and the Midwest, the influence of German culinary habits was noticeable. Prisoners built makeshift brick ovens beside the barracks to bake rye loaves or prepare sauerkraut from cabbage supplied by local farms. These small privileges were not spontaneous acts of kindness. They were approved through formal channels, as long as they improved morale without breaching security. The War Department viewed content prisoners as easier to manage and less likely to cause disturbances. The result was an atmosphere where order produced comfort, not luxury, but stability. Religious and cultural holidays became further tests of this system. On Christmas and Easter, American officers permitted special meals. Camp kitchens served roast meat, potatoes, and occasionally small desserts such as pies or canned fruit. Chaplains, both American and German, held services, and music from harmonicas or makeshift choirs drifted through the compounds. On Thanksgiving, guards shared turkey dinners from their own rations, and prisoners noted with amazement that the portions were identical. These events were not mere gestures of charity. They were expressions of an American belief that adherence to custom and ritual reaffirmed humanity even within captivity. For the German soldiers, many of whom had been indoctrinated with the idea that mercy was weakness, this experience was deeply confusing. The food they received was not a symbol of surrender but of control, a structured generosity that made cruelty unnecessary. The Americans did not need to starve their enemies to prove victory. Instead, they demonstrated power through restraint, a form of dominance that operated within rules rather than outside them. The consistency of the meals began to erode the emotional distance between captor and captive. Guards and prisoners remained separated by uniform and authority, yet they shared the same climate, the same routines, and often the same food. On hot summer days, when the Texas sun turned the ground to dust, both sides drank from the same metal cups filled with lukewarm water. During harvest seasons, prisoners worked in nearby fields, ate lunches of sandwiches and fruit under armed supervision, and returned to the camp for dinner prepared by their own compatriots. The ordinary rhythm of food and work slowly replaced fear with familiarity. Inspections by the International Red Cross reinforced the sense of legitimacy. Reports noted that prisoners appeared healthy, well-fed, and even overweight compared to those held in Europe. Medical officers documented steady weight gain and low illness rates, proof that nutrition levels were being maintained. The Red Cross also confirmed that prisoners were permitted to receive food parcels from home through neutral intermediaries, which further improved morale. Some camps organized cooking classes and competitions among prisoners, turning kitchens into spaces of routine normalcy in an otherwise confined world. The meals, once an instrument of mistrust, became a symbol of order that transcended ideology. For many Germans, the simple act of being fed properly, of eating the same bread as their guards, challenged everything they had been taught about the supposed barbarity of their enemies. In a war defined by total destruction, the maintenance of regular meals, 3 times a day, at the same hour, with the same measured portion, was an assertion of civilization itself. By the later years of the war, what began as disbelief had transformed into a quiet respect for the structure of the system. Prisoners who had entered the camps expecting vengeance found instead regulation. The meals reminded them daily that the rules of the United States Army, not the passions of men, governed their fate. In that predictability, they experienced a rare form of dignity, the dignity of being treated as soldiers rather than as spoils. And though they remained behind barbed wire, the food that sustained them carried a meaning far greater than nourishment. It was proof that even in captivity, order could be humane. When the war ended and the German prisoners were gradually repatriated, their stories began to ripple across a country reduced to rubble. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of hunger. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was paralyzed, and civilians survived on meager rations often below subsistence level. Into this atmosphere of deprivation returned men who had spent months or even years eating 3 regulated meals a day behind barbed wire in the United States. Their accounts of captivity sounded almost unreal to those who listened. They spoke of clean barracks, organized routines, and food that was not only sufficient but carefully measured to meet legal standards. To a population living through post-war starvation, such tales bordered on fantasy. These stories spread quickly through letters, community gatherings, and local newspapers. Many returning prisoners wrote memoirs or contributed testimonies to regional archives, describing in detail how the Americans had treated them. What astonished listeners was not indulgence or comfort, but the principle behind it, the idea that even an enemy could be fed according to law. In a society emerging from 12 years of totalitarian ideology, this notion carried enormous moral weight. For men who had once fought for a regime built on hierarchy and racial superiority, the experience of being treated as equals in the most basic human need, food, was transformative. Historians later observed that these returning prisoners played an unexpected role in reshaping German perceptions of the United States. During the early years of the occupation, American authorities faced deep resentment and mistrust from civilians who viewed them as conquerors. Yet the ex-prisoners often became informal mediators between occupiers and the local population. They had lived inside the American system and had seen its discipline and predictability. They told others that the Americans did not act out of sentiment but out of adherence to rules. That distinction mattered. It suggested that justice could exist without humiliation and that power could operate through restraint. Sociological studies conducted in the late 1940s by both German and American researchers confirmed this shift. Many repatriated soldiers expressed respect, even admiration, for the American approach to order. They contrasted it with their own wartime experiences under a regime that had demanded obedience without explanation. For them, the U.S. camp system became a symbol of a new kind of authority, one that combined power with consistency. Some of these men later joined Reconstruction efforts, local governance, or educational initiatives, carrying with them the memory of that structured fairness. The impact was not limited to individual reflection, it extended to national identity. The principles they had witnessed in captivity, rule of law, procedural equality, administrative transparency, resonated with the democratic reforms introduced under Allied occupation. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, its emphasis on legality and human rights echoed, in part, the lessons learned by those who had experienced the American system firsthand. For a generation of former soldiers, the fair treatment they received in captivity served as living evidence that democracy was not chaos but order under conscience. American officials, too, recognized the propaganda value of these experiences. Reports by the Office of War Information and later by the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division cited the positive testimonies of returning prisoners as evidence of successful psychological operations. Without overt indoctrination, the POW program had achieved what deliberate re-education campaigns often struggled to do. It had demonstrated American values through consistent behavior. In the words of one War Department summary, "The daily meal served in the camp mess hall did more to teach the idea of justice than 100 leaflets." For post-war Germany, these memories became a bridge between two former enemies. The image of the American camp, disciplined, efficient, and bound by law, stood in sharp contrast to the chaos of the collapsing Reich. It represented not just material abundance but moral stability, a society capable of defeating its foes without losing its structure. As the Marshall Plan began and German-American cooperation deepened, these earlier experiences provided a foundation of cautious trust. In personal letters and memoirs written decades later, former prisoners often returned to the same image, the mess hall table. They remembered the smell of coffee, the sound of metal trays, the quiet routine of being fed on time. For many, it was at that table that they first glimpsed the possibility of a different world. A world where equality could exist without weakness and where power could coexist with fairness. The food they had once distrusted became, in hindsight, a metaphor for democracy itself, predictable, restrained, and governed by rules rather than passions. By the 1950s, the honest meal of the American camps had become part of Germany's collective memory of the war, told and retold in families and veteran circles. It symbolized not indulgence but dignity, the dignity of being treated as human by a former enemy. That memory, carried quietly through generations, helped transform the way Germans viewed America. For many who had once worn the uniform of the Reich, the most enduring lesson of their captivity was not military defeat but the realization that respect, once extended even to a prisoner, could outlast any victory won by force. The legacy of the American prisoner of war camps extended far beyond the barbed wire and wooden barracks where they once stood. What had begun as a logistical necessity during wartime evolved into one of the quietest yet most enduring chapters of post-war diplomacy. When the prisoners returned to Germany, they carried with them experiences that challenged not only their perception of the United States, but also the moral assumptions of their own society. In a nation reduced to ashes, their stories of fairness and order seemed improbable, almost mythical. Yet these myths were rooted in fact, reinforced by the testimonies of hundreds of thousands of men who had lived them. In the devastated cities of 1945 and 1946, hunger was a daily reality. German civilians survived on as little as 1,000 calories a day, relying on makeshift gardens and black market exchanges. Against this background, returning prisoners spoke of American camps where food was distributed evenly, where rules were followed regardless of status, and where the law itself was treated as sacred. To a population accustomed to the arbitrary cruelty of dictatorship, such stories sounded less like captivity and more like a lesson in civilization. The camp meal became a paradoxical image of moral nourishment, a demonstration that power could operate through restraint rather than oppression. This legacy took on institutional form in the years that followed. When the United States and its allies began the reconstruction of West Germany, the emphasis on legality, due process, and bureaucratic accountability mirrored the same administrative order that had governed the POW system. many former prisoners recognized familiar patterns in the post-war reforms: clear regulations, transparent procedures, and the idea that justice must be measurable and documented. What they had once seen in the mess hall, a system where fairness was enforced by rules rather than sentiment, they now saw echoed in the emerging democratic institutions of the Federal Republic. Historians later observed that the POW experience functioned as an unintended school of democracy. The men who had lived under a totalitarian command structure were confronted with a version of authority that was impersonal yet just. For them, the American Guards embodied a kind of discipline that did not rely on ideology or terror. The rules of the camp, the precision of rations, and the predictability of daily routines revealed a moral framework where order and fairness could coexist. When these men reintegrated into civilian life, many brought with them a respect for that kind of order. In interviews conducted by German sociologists in the 1950s, former prisoners often described the American system as their first encounter with a society governed by laws rather than commands. The symbolic power of that experience grew over time. American officials recognized that their treatment of prisoners had become a subtle instrument of soft power. During the early Cold War, as Germany became a key ally in the confrontation with the Soviet Union, the positive memories of captivity contributed to pro-American sentiment among former soldiers and their families. These men became part of a social foundation that viewed the United States not merely as an occupying force but as a model of disciplined democracy. In this sense, the mess halls and barracks of wartime America became precursors to the ideological reconstruction of post-war Europe. Even decades later, the memory of those camps persisted in veterans' memoirs, community histories, and oral testimonies. Some former prisoners revisited the sites of their internment, now converted into parks, schools, or industrial zones, and reflected on the strange irony that their first taste of equality had occurred behind fences. They spoke of the same wooden tables, the same tin trays, the same steady rhythm of meals served without favoritism. What had seemed ordinary to their captors had become extraordinary in their memory, a moment when civilization proved stronger than hatred. The American camps, often overlooked in the grand narrative of victory, represented a quieter triumph, the victory of procedure over passion, of law over vengeance. In a world scarred by total war, they showed that discipline and humanity need not be opposites. The principle that every man, even an enemy, was entitled to a measured portion of food according to rule became a small but profound symbol of moral order. By the time Germany was rebuilt and integrated into the Western Alliance, the story of those rations, the equal meals served to prisoner and guard alike, had become part of the moral vocabulary of the post-war generation. It stood as evidence that justice could survive even amid destruction, that the same systems capable of waging total war could also enforce total fairness. The legacy of that system was not written in treaties or speeches but in memory, in the recollection of a bowl of soup, a loaf of bread, and the realization that dignity, once extended even to a captive, could endure long after the guns had fallen silent. The story of how German prisoners of war were fed in the United States was, at its core, a confrontation between two worldviews. On one side stood a system born of hierarchy, ideology, and fear, a system that measured human worth through obedience and blood. On the other stood a society that sought order not through domination but through the rule of law. The war had been a struggle of machines, armies, and empires, but within the fences of American POW camps it became, in miniature, a struggle between two moral structures. The Germans had come from a regime that glorified inequality as natural and necessary. The Americans represented a world where equality was procedural, impersonal, and therefore inescapable. In the everyday reality of the camps, this conflict of principles played out in the most ordinary ritual imaginable, the distribution of food. The act of receiving a meal, measured, scheduled, and guaranteed, embodied the difference between tyranny and discipline. The Germans were not treated kindly in a sentimental sense. They were treated correctly, according to written regulation. There was no gesture of compassion, no emotional reconciliation, only the persistent logic of law. Yet it was precisely this mechanical fairness that carried moral force. The absence of hatred, the predictability of procedure, and the insistence that even an enemy must be fed properly revealed a kind of strength that totalitarianism could never replicate. For many prisoners, the experience dismantled assumptions that had been ingrained since childhood. The Nazi vision of the world had reduced morality to loyalty, and justice to hierarchy. In that vision, mercy was weakness, and law was a tool of power. In captivity, these men encountered a different understanding of both concepts. The Americans were powerful because they could afford restraint. They followed rules not because they feared punishment but because they believed those rules defined who they were. To a mind accustomed to viewing order as a form of oppression, the idea that order could exist to protect even one's enemy was revolutionary. This realization did not come through words or lectures but through repetition, the silent, daily assurance that rules would not bend. A man who woke each morning to the same measured portion of food, the same routine, and the same impartial treatment gradually absorbed a new understanding of authority. The Americans had defeated them not by breaking them, but by surrounding them with a system so stable that it made cruelty unnecessary. For soldiers raised in a world where obedience was enforced through fear, that kind of order seemed almost spiritual. The equal ration became more than a meal, it became a metaphor for moral equilibrium. Every plate filled according to standard, every calorie counted, every inspection recorded was a declaration that civilization could survive even amid war. The Americans' discipline in following the Geneva Convention revealed that law, when applied without exception, was capable of achieving what ideology could not: the preservation of humanity. In the arithmetic of total war, such gestures appeared small, almost trivial. But for those who experienced them, they were proof that ethics could be institutional rather than rhetorical, that justice could exist not as an emotion, but as a structure. To the Germans who returned home, this encounter with procedural fairness lingered long after their release. Many later described how the experience had challenged the very notion of defeat. They had lost the war but discovered that dignity could endure without victory. The Americans had demonstrated a kind of moral architecture, a belief that strength did not require cruelty, that victory did not demand degradation, and that power governed by conscience was not weakness but permanence. In the ruins of post-war Europe, that lesson outlived the camps themselves. The idea that a system of rules could outlast violence, that restraint could achieve what fear could not, became one of the quiet moral inheritances of the 20th century. It found expression not in monuments or treaties, but in the private memories of those who had once been enemies. They remembered the sound of tin trays, the warmth of soup, the order of a line that treated every man the same. The feeding of prisoners in America was not an act of charity, it was a declaration of faith in law. And in that faith lay a subtle revolution, the transformation of captivity into instruction, of defeat into reflection. The Germans who ate under the supervision of their former foes experienced, perhaps for the first time, a civilization that defined itself not by conquest but by consistency. In that realization, many found the first glimpse of what it meant to be free. The true power of the system that held them was not its barbed wire, but its refusal to abandon its own principles. In the end, that refusal, quiet, bureaucratic, and unwavering, became one of the most enduring victories of the war.